The secret to surviving a medieval knight. We picture the medieval knight as a titan of the battlefield, a fortress of steel, charging headlong into a storm of arrows and swords. We see him in the heat of battle, his armor gleaming, his courage absolute. But what happened after the last sword was swung for the day? What happened when the sun began to dip below the horizon, and the army ground to a halt in some forgotten, hostile field? For a medieval knight on campaign, the greatest test of strength wasn't the clash of swords on the battlefield. It was the silent, creeping battle that started the moment the sun went down, while his 50 pounds of steel armor could stop an arrow. It was useless against the real enemies of a military campaign: the biting cold, the sickness that spread through the dark, and the constant, gnawing threat of a surprise attack. These were the foes that could cripple an army without a single sword being drawn. So how did they pull it off? How did an army of thousands, stranded in enemy territory, possibly endure until morning? The secret wasn't about brute force. It was a series of forgotten rituals they performed every single evening, disciplined response to the relentless dangers of the dark. This wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. This was the silent, nightly war that determined who would be left to fight when the sun rose again.
The problem: sundown is coming. Imagine the scene. The day's ending. 4:10, maybe 12 hours. You've been on the march. If you're a knight, you might have been on horseback, but that's no guarantee of comfort. The constant motion, the weight of even partial armor, and the sheer mental fatigue of navigating rough roads and staying vigilant has worn you down. For the foot soldiers, it's even worse. They've trudged 10 or 15 miles over broken ground, carrying their own gear, their feet blistered and their bodies aching. The air, once thick with the dust of the road and the heat of the day, now grows cool. A damp chill begins to seep from the ground, a chilling promise of the cold to come. The signal to make camp ripples through the column, and you can almost hear a collective sigh of relief. But that relief is fleeting, quickly replaced by a different kind of anxiety. The daylight, which offered some semblance of safety and clarity, is now a finite resource, bleeding away with every passing minute. The night itself is the enemy. In the darkness, every shadow can hide a threat. The familiar landscape of the day morphs into a labyrinth of uncertainty. The snap of a twig could be a foraging animal, or it could be an enemy scout. A cough from a nearby soldier could be a simple cold, or it could be the first sign of dysentery, the dreaded bloody flux that could sweep through a camp and kill more men than any battle. The threats are legion, both physical and psychological. First up, the cold. Without proper shelter, the damp ground will leach warmth from a sleeping body, leading to exposure, illness, and a weakened state that makes a soldier useless for the next day's march. Then there's the rain. A sudden downpour can soak everything: bedding, clothes, food, turning a miserable night into a potentially lethal one. Wet soldiers are sick soldiers, and a sick army is a defeated army. Beyond the elements, there's the human threat. Now, massive nighttime battles were rare. Trying to command thousands of men in the pitch black was a recipe for chaos and friendly fire. But that didn't mean the night was safe. Small-scale raids, ambushes on sentries, and attempts to steal horses or supplies were a constant worrying. An enemy could use the cover of darkness to probe defenses, create panic, or even assassinate a high-value target like a knight. This constant state of hypervigilance took a tremendous psychological toll. Medieval chronicles tell of knights haunted by their experiences, waking up screaming in the night, unable to find real rest. In a world without modern therapy, these symptoms were often seen through a moral or religious lens, but the trauma was just as real. And finally, there's the most insidious enemy of all: disease. A medieval military camp was a temporary city of thousands, with rudimentary sanitation at best. Latrines were usually just ditches dug on the outskirts, hopefully downstream from the water source, but in the close quarters of a camp, with contaminated water and swarms of flies, diseases like dysentery and typhoid could spread like wildfire. Military commanders knew to avoid marshy ground, as they believed the rising vapors and rank smell brought pestilence. They were right about the danger, even if they didn't understand the germ theory behind it. So that's the setup. The knight is exhausted. His body is screaming for rest, but the world around him has just become infinitely more dangerous. His armor, the very symbol of his power, is about to become a liability. His survival, and the survival of his men, now, depends not on his skill with a sword, but on a rigid, almost ceremonial, set of tasks designed to hold the knight at bay. The battle for the dawn has just begun.
The ritual of preparation problem. The steel prison removing the armor, the first order of business, and one of the most critical rituals of the evening, was dealing with the armor. Pop culture loves the image of the knight sleeping in his full plate harness, ready to leap into battle at a moment's notice. This is almost entirely a myth. Sleeping in full armor was reserved for the most desperate of circumstances, like the night before Agincourt, where Henry V's outnumbered army lay in a muddy field, expecting a French attack at any second. In a situation like that, men slept in partial armor out of sheer necessity, knowing that the time it would take to put Eton could mean life or death. But on a typical campaign night, sleeping in 50+ pounds of steel wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The metal would suck away body heat, especially on the cold ground. The restrictive plates could impede circulation, and some pieces, like the steel collar known as a gorget, could even become a choking hazard. If a knight's head slumped forward in sleep, it was miserable, impractical, and unhealthy, something to be avoided at all costs. Therefore, the first ritual was liberation. A knight couldn't just unbutton his armor like a coat. It was a complex suit of interlocking plates, buckles, and straps that required help. This was the primary job of his squire. The process was methodical, almost like a reverse ceremony of arming, starting from the outside in and from the extremities. First came the gauntlets, freeing the hands. Then the helmet would be lifted off, offering a blessed rush of cool air and an unobstructed view. That moment alone must have felt like being released from a sensory deprivation chamber. Then, the squire would work his way down the body, sabatons from the feet, greaves from the shins, polans from the knees, and cuisses from the thighs, all unbuckled and removed, piece by piece. Finally, the heavier torso defense, the breastplate and backplate would be lifted off. Underneath all this was a layer of mail protecting the joints, and finally, the padded gambeson, or arming doublet. The physical relief would have been immense, a shedding of weight that allowed the knight to finally breathe deeply and move freely. But this relief came with a new and profound sense of vulnerability. For hours, he'd been a walking fortress. Now, he stood in his linen undershirt and hose, a soft target. This psychological shift was a key part of the nightly transition. But the ritual wasn't over. The armor couldn't just be piled in a corner. It was an extraordinarily expensive, life-saving investment that needed meticulous care. The squire would inspect each piece for dents and damage. Straps would be checked for wear. More importantly, the armor had to be cleaned and protected from its greatest enemy, rust. The squire would use sand, vinegar, or even a piece of stone to scour away any rust spots from sweat or rain. Then, each piece was carefully wiped down with an oily rag to create a protective barrier against the damp night air. This wasn't just housekeeping, it was essential maintenance. A rusted joint could impede movement in battle. A rust-pitted plate could fail under a blow. The armor was then laid out on a cloth, or stand inside the knight's tent, close at hand, ready for an emergency. This whole process, removal, inspection, cleaning, oiling, was a non-negotiable part of the routine. It reinforced the absolute trust between a knight and his squire. Only once his steel skin was cared for could the knight turn his attention to his own mortal and suddenly very fragile body. Problem: a city from nothing securing the camp, now unarmored. The knight was just one man among thousands, exposed in a hostile landscape. The second great challenge was shelter and security for the entire army. An army on the move was a mobile city, and every evening, the city had to be built from scratch in just a few hours. This wasn't some haphazard affair, it was a carefully planned logistical and defensive operation. This job often fell to a specialized officer, known in English armies as a harbinger. These men would ride ahead of the main force to select and lay out the campsite. Their choice of location was everything, and these guys had a checklist. First, a defensible position. High, open ground was better than a valley. Natural barriers like a river or a cliff could be used to protect one side of the camp. Second, resources. A source of fresh water was non-negotiable for drinking, cooking, and for the thousands of animals. They also needed wood for fires and fortifications, and critically, they were under strict orders to avoid swampy land. They knew the foul smell brought sickness, correctly identifying these areas as breeding grounds for disease. Once the site was chosen, the layout was a direct reflection of medieval social hierarchy. The commander's tent went right in the center, the nerve center of the army. Radiating out from it were the pavilions of the other high-ranking nobles and knights. The closer your tent was to the commanders, the higher your status. Farther out were the men at arms and craftsmen, and on the very periphery were the common soldiers, archers, and camp followers. This layout wasn't just for social status. It was a defense-in-depth strategy. If an attack came, the alarm would be raised on the perimeter, and the concentric circles of the camp would act as layers of defense, buying precious time for the command staff in the center to react. The perimeter itself was the next priority. While they didn't build Roman-style forts, they did create makeshift defenses. A common tactic was the Wagenburg, where supply wagons were circled up to form a surprisingly effective wall against cavalry. If that wasn't an option, soldiers would dig a shallow ditch and create a low rampart, sometimes topped with sharpened stakes. The final, crucial element of security was setting the watch. This was deadly serious. Sentries were placed along the perimeter and at key approaches. They were given a password or watchword for the night. Roving patrols moved between them, making sure everyone was awake and alert. The penalty for being caught sleeping on watch was often death, as one dozing sentry could doom the entire army. For a knight, often an officer, this meant he had a direct role in security. He might be the officer of the watch, responsible for making the rounds, checking his men, and enforcing the password. The safety of the camp rested on this disciplined, unbroken chain of vigilance. The temporary city was built, its flimsy walls were up, and its human sensors were in place. Only then could the men inside turn to their next pressing need, filling their empty stomachs. The gnawing hunger the evening meal an army, as the old saying goes, marches on its stomach. This was brutally true in the Middle Ages. The logistical challenge of feeding thousands was immense, and a failure in supply could cause a defeat. More surely than any enemy weapon, the evening meal wasn't just about fighting hunger. It was about morale, social order, and refueling for the next day. Supplying an army was a patchwork of strategies. They had baggage trains with non-perishables, but they were slow and vulnerable. So, armies on the move relied heavily on foraging and pillaging or living off the land. Foraging parties would range out, gathering, buying, or simply taking whatever food they could find. An army of 20,000 could strip a 10-mile wide path of all its resources, leaving a wasteland in its wake. When the army camped, the food was distributed, and again, the social hierarchy was on full display. The common soldier's meal was simple and grim. The centerpiece was often pottage, a thick, soupy stew cooked for hours in large communal cauldrons. The ingredients were whatever was available: oats, beans, peas, and foraged vegetables like carrots or onions. If they were lucky, some salted meat might be thrown in. This was served with hard bread or biscuit, which often had to be soaked in the pottage just to be edible. The knight's dining experience was vastly different. As a man of status, he was part of a smaller household unit, called a mesne, with its own cook and supplies. His meal would still be simple by courtly standards, but luxurious by comparison. He could expect roasted meat, perhaps game hunted that day, or salted beef and pork. He'd have better bread, cheese, and maybe some dried fruits. His food might even have expensive spices, a clear marker of wealth. And here's a crucial point. He drank wine or ale. Before anyone understood germ theory, experience taught them that water near a large camp was often dangerous. Beer and wine, however, were much safer because the alcohol killed many harmful bacteria. So while we might see it as a luxury, drinking fermented beverages was actually a practical public health measure. The common soldier got ale. The knight enjoyed wine. The campfire was the heart of the evening's social life. It provided warmth, light, and a focal point for camaraderie. Around the fires, men would mend their gear, tell stories, and find a brief break from the day's hardships. For the knight, dining with his messmate reinforced the bonds of loyalty with the men he'd fight alongside. But even this moment of comfort was shadowed by danger. If supplies ran low or food spoiled, hunger would quickly weaken the army's resistance to both disease and fatigue. The evening meal was a critical ritual, a brief victory against the emptiness in their stomachs, but one that had to be won again every single day. The biting cold and the drenching rain staying warm and dry with bellies full. The next challenge was defending against the elements. A cold, wet soldier is a sick soldier. Staying warm and dry through a long medieval night was a matter of survival, and how well you managed depended entirely on your rank. At the top, you had the pavilion of a great lord or king. These weren't just tents. They were mobile apartments of heavy canvas, sometimes brightly colored with the lord's coat of arms. They could be multi-roomed, furnished with folding tables, chests, and even portable beds with straw mattresses and fur blankets. A charcoal brazier might provide smokeless heat. A knight, while not living in a mobile palace, would still have a private tent. It was probably a simpler bell or wedge tent, but it offered crucial protection from wind and rain. Inside, he'd have a straw pallet, but a dry one. He'd have his own wool blankets and maybe a fur throw. His squire would likely sleep in the same tent, providing both service and security. Just being enclosed, shielded from the elements, provided a huge measure of psychological comfort. Now, contrast this with the common soldier. For most of them, there were no tents at all. Survival depended on ingenuity. A lucky group might find shelter under a supply wagon. Others would build crude lean-tos from branches. Many had nothing more than their own wool cloak to wrap themselves in as they tried to sleep on the open, damp ground, huddling together around the campfires for shared warmth. Rain was the great equalizer of misery, though even then, the hierarchy of suffering remained. A downpour turned the camp into a sea of mud. While the knight in his tent dealt with leaks, the soldier in the open was completely exposed. Soaked to the skin, with no way to get dry, his night became a wretched ordeal. This wasn't just miserable, it was a direct path to hypothermia and illness. Historical records are full of campaigns crippled not by the enemy, but by disease that swept through armies after periods of cold, wet weather. The campfire was, therefore, life itself. Keeping the fires going through the night was a constant struggle. For a knight, staying comfortable was part of his duty. He had to stay healthy to lead, but a good leader also looked out for his men, perhaps organizing the construction of better shelters or ensuring a fair rotation around the fire. The battle against the cold was relentless. Every degree of warmth preserved was an investment in the next day's fight. The difference between a dry blanket and a soaked cloak could be the difference between a fighting soldier and a casualty. The uneasy sleep, the interrupted night with the armor off, camp secured, belly full, and shelter found. The final challenge was getting some rest. But sleep in an army camp wasn't the peaceful, uninterrupted 8 hours we prize today. It was fragmented, shallow, and anxious, governed by military discipline and the constant underlying hum of fear. The very rhythm of sleep was different. Many pre-industrial societies practiced what historians call segmented sleep. People would go to bed after dusk, wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night for chores or prayer, and then return for a second sleep. On a military campaign, however, this natural rhythm was shattered by the demanding schedule of the watch. No one in an army camp slept through the night. because the camp itself could never sleep. The night was divided into several watch periods, each lasting a few hours, and a knight, as an officer, would be assigned a specific watch. His sleep was deliberately broken. He might eat, then try to get a few hours of rest. Then, in the dead of night, his squire would wake him. He'd have to rise from his relatively warm bed, pull on some protection, and venture out into the cold, dark camp. His job was to make the rounds of his sector, checking on the sentries, making sure they were alert, and listening to their reports. He was looking for any sign of trouble, a distant torch, the sound of horses where there should be none. The lives of thousands of men rested on his vigilance. This duty was incredibly stressful. The darkness plays tricks on the eyes and ears. The wind could sound like a whisper. The state of high alert was mentally exhausting. After his watch, he could return to his tent for a second sleep, but it was often a fitful, uneasy rest. The French knight Geoffroy de Charny wrote in the 14th century about the hardships of this life, the poor sleep, the hunger, the constant anxiety. Many knights likely suffered from conditions we would now recognize as PTSD. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, it's all there in the historical record. For the common soldier, sleep was even more precarious. Huddled in the open, deep sleep was a luxury he could rarely afford. He too had to take his turn on watch, and when he slept, it was always with one ear open, listening for the alarm. The system of interrupted sleep, night after night, wore down the entire army. Sleep deprivation slows reaction times and impairs judgment. Surviving the night wasn't just about avoiding an ambush. It was about managing this relentless cycle of exhaustion. Sleep wasn't a peaceful escape, but another battlefield. The climax, surviving until dawn's climax of this nightly struggle, wasn't a thunderous charge or a dramatic duel. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the world. It began with the faintest lightening of the eastern sky, a subtle change from impenetrable black to a deep, bruised purple. It was the first promise of dawn, a sign that the long siege of the night was almost over. This was the moment of greatest danger and greatest hope. The pre-dawn twilight, the stand to, was a notoriously dangerous time. It offered just enough light for an organized attack, but enough shadow to conceal an enemy's approach. The entire camp would be roused, every man standing to arms, peering into the gloom, waiting. The cold was at its most bitter. Nerves were frayed. This was the final test. As the sun finally broke the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, a collective, unspoken sigh of relief would pass through the ranks. They had made it. They had survived. The enemies of the night, cold, fear, sickness, attack, had been held at bay for one more cycle. Now, the evening rituals were reversed. Fires were built up for a quick breakfast, likely more hard biscuit and ale for the common soldier. Then came the second great ritual of the night's day, the arming. His squire would begin the laborious process of encasing his master in steel. Once more, it was a slow, deliberate transformation, turning a man of flesh and blood back into a living weapon. This entire process was a physical representation of the army's purpose. The nightly rituals were all for this moment, to ensure that this man, and thousands like him, were fit enough to put on their armor and fight an army that had endured a night of cold, wet, sleepless misery was an army already half-beaten. Its soldiers would be slow, sick, and demoralized. The nightly rituals were therefore not about comfort, but about combat readiness. Removing the armor, securing the camp, eating a hot meal, finding shelter, organizing the watch, every step was a crucial link in the chain of military effectiveness. The true secret to surviving a medieval night, and thus a medieval campaign, was discipline. It was the discipline of the harbinger choosing a camp, the squire cleaning armor, the sentry staying awake at his post, and the knight himself, enduring it all to lead his men. As the knight settled into his saddle, the sun warming the cold steel of his helmet, he would look out over the now dismantled camp as the army formed its long column of march. He had won the silent battle. He had survived the night, and now he was ready to face the day. Conclusion. In Tasso, when you picture that knight in shining armor, remember that his reality was far more than just the battlefield. His most formidable enemy wasn't always a rival on a war horse, but the silent, relentless siege of the night itself. Survival depended on a series of forgotten rituals, a nightly discipline that was the very foundation of military power. From the meticulous care of his priceless armor to the strategic layout of a temporary city, every action was a calculated move against cold, disease, and attack. The evening meal was a logistical triumph, the search for warmth was a constant battle, and the anxious, broken sleep was a psychological ordeal that took a heavy toll. These nightly tactics weren't about creating a comfortable life. That was impossible. They were about preserving the army as a functional fighting machine, ensuring that when the sun rose, the soldiers were healthy enough, rested enough, and organized enough to fight and win. The secret to surviving a medieval night was understanding that the war never truly stopped when the sun went down. So I have a question for you. Having heard about this nightly ordeal, which of these challenges do you think would be the hardest to endure? The physical misery of the biting cold and gnawing hunger? The constant, low-level fear of an attack in the dark? Or the deep, mental exhaustion from weeks of broken sleep? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths and brutal realities of the medieval world, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.